The old oak pews of St. Jude's Church always smelled the same, a mixture of lemon wax, incense, and the ancient dust that had settled into the carved patterns over centuries. For Arthur Blackwood, this scent was an anchor. Not a particularly religious man, he had made the Sunday service his ritual after Lily's death a year ago, a quiet, solemn way to get through another week without falling apart. Here, amidst the hushed voices and the trembling notes of the organ, he could let his grief simply exist, without trying to analyze or suppress it. Sunlight, filtering through the stained glass windows, painted trembling patches of color on the floor, blue, crimson, and gold. Arthur watched them slide slowly across the stone tiles, and thought how much Lily would have loved this play of light. She would have surely tried to catch a colored sunbeam, and her laughter would have echoed under the high vaults, breaking the reverent silence. The memory brought the familiar ache to his chest. Father Michael, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and a soft, soothing voice, was leading the service. His words were familiar, flowing like a steady stream, washing over the grieving souls of Havenwood. Arthur listened with half an ear, letting the rhythm of the sermon lull his anxieties. The routine was known by heart: sermon, prayer, communion, blessing. Another 40 minutes, and he could return home to the emptiness, where the silence was far more oppressive than it was here. The communion began. The parishioners, heads bowed, made their way to the altar. Mrs. Henderson, whose arthritic knees clicked loudly, old Mr. Abernathy, who smelled of mothballs and mints, a young family with 3 restless children. All the same faces, all the same sorrows and hopes hidden behind a mask of Sunday piety. Arthur rose and joined the line, mechanically moving his feet. Kneeling at the altar rail, he felt the cold of the worn velvet on his forearms. Father Michael approached, his face as serene as ever. The priest uttered the ritual words, his voice quiet and even. The body of Christ, the bread of heaven. The priest placed the wafer in Arthur's mouth, and in that moment, the familiar world cracked. Instead of the dry, tasteless starch that instantly stuck to the roof of his mouth, he felt something else. Soft, fibrous. The wafer wasn't dissolving. It was turning soggy under his tongue, becoming a disgusting, warm pulp. And then came the taste. A coppery, salty flavor that was impossible to mistake for anything else. The taste of fresh blood. Arthur felt sick. He almost spat the repulsive lump out right there on the altar. His heart hammered in his throat, and a roar filled his ears. This couldn't be happening. Just his imagination, stress, grief. He tried to find a rational explanation, but his body screamed the opposite. Suppressing a gag, he forced himself to swallow. The blood of Christ, the cup of salvation. Father Michael brought the silver chalice to his lips. Arthur desperately hoped the tart taste of the wine would wash away the horrible sensation. He took a sip. The liquid was thick and warm. Not wine. Not a hint of wine's acidity or sweetness. The same blood, warm and viscous, flowed down his throat, leaving a metallic aftertaste. A wave of icy horror washed over him. He coughed, recoiling from the chalice. He jerked his head up to look into Father Michael's eyes, to see some kind of explanation, a joke, a mistake, anything. But there was no one behind the altar. The spot where the priest had stood a second ago was empty. The chalice and the paten with the wafers were gone. Not a sound, not a movement. Father Michael had simply vanished. In a panic, Arthur turned around. Maybe the priest had stepped away. Maybe he fell ill. But what he saw was more terrifying than any disappearance. The entire congregation, Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Abernathy, the young family, they were all kneeling or sitting in their pews, and they were all staring straight ahead. Their jaws moved slowly, rhythmically, chewing it. But their eyes were empty, glassy, devoid of any glimmer of thought or feeling. They weren't looking at the altar, or the stained glass, or each other. Their gazes were fixed on nothing. The gazes of mannequins, dolls with their souls removed, as if someone had turned off the light behind their eyes. And in that ghastly silence, there was only one sound, the wet smacking chewing of dozens of mouths. Arthur stumbled backward, clumsily getting to his feet. He tripped over his own leg and sent a heavy hymnal crashing to the floor. The sound echoed through the dead silence of the church. No one turned. No one flinched. Empty eyes, mechanical chewing, and the taste of fresh flesh and blood in his mouth. Beside himself with terror, Arthur turned and bolted for the exit. He shoved the heavy oak doors open and tumbled out into the blinding sunlight of the Sunday morning. He bent over, hands on his knees, and vomited onto the immaculately trimmed lawn. But even then, he couldn't get rid of the taste. The taste of a foreign, unholy communion. The world outside was absurdly normal. Birds chirped, the sound of a lawnmower drifted from a nearby street, and a light breeze rustled the leaves of the old maple tree by the church fence. The idyllic scene was so incompatible with what he had just witnessed that Arthur's head spun. He looked back at the massive church doors. They were closed. Silence. Nothing hinted at the silent, gruesome feast that continued within. It felt as though he were standing on the edge of two worlds, one bright, alive, and familiar, the other quiet, dark, and utterly monstrous. And the border between them had just been erased. Instead of walking to his car, parked a little further down the street, he let his legs carry him away, far from that place. He ran without direction, gasping for air, choking on panic and the remnants of vomit. Every sound behind him made him flinch. He imagined the doors swinging open at any moment, and the silent procession with empty eyes following him out. Arthur didn't stop until his lungs burned with fire. He found himself in the small town park by the river, the same one where he and Lily used to walk in the evenings. Collapsing onto a bench under a weeping willow, he felt his body begin to shake. A hallucination. It had to be a hallucination. He clung to that thought like a drowning man to a life raft. Grief, stress, lack of sleep. Arthur had read that mourning could cause visual and auditory deceptions. Maybe gustatory ones, too. Maybe his mind, exhausted by loss, had played a cruel, vicious trick on him. Father Michael could have just stepped into the sacristy for something, and in his panic, he hadn't noticed. And the parishioners, maybe the light had hit them at such an angle that their eyes seemed empty? And the chewing, people chew the host, that's normal. Yes, everything could be explained. He just needed to calm down and think rationally. He sat like that for perhaps half an hour, watching the ripples on the water and forcing himself to breathe evenly. The panic slowly receded, replaced by a ringing emptiness and doubt. Was he going mad? Deciding to avoid the main street, he took the back roads home, through quiet lanes with neat houses and flowering gardens. And as he turned onto his own street, he saw her. Mrs. Henderson in her gardening hat, shears in hand, lovingly trimming her famous roses. When she noticed him, she smiled a perfectly ordinary, good-natured smile. "Lovely morning, Arthur." "Isn't it?" she called out. Her eyes, which only an hour ago had seemed like glass marbles, now sparkled cheerfully in the sun. There was life in them. "Yes, Mrs. Henderson." "Lovely," he managed to force out and quicken his pace. This normality frightened him more than the horror in the church. If she didn't remember anything, then it really had all been in his head. It meant that he, Arthur Blackwood, a 42-year-old architect, was slowly and surely losing his mind. Bursting into his house, he locked the door behind him, turning every bolt. The silence that had once oppressed him now felt like a salvation. He went to the bathroom and splashed his face with icy water. Lifting his head, he looked at his reflection in the mirror. A pale face, pupils dilated with terror. The standard look for a man on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But something was wrong. He looked closer at his mouth. At the corners of his lips, there was a faint dark residue, like that from a rich red wine. He rubbed his lips with his finger and realized the stain wasn't coming off. His heart skipped another beat. He opened his mouth. His tongue looked strange, slightly swollen, and across its surface, a barely visible pattern was emerging, like blackened capillaries, a fine web of darkness. That definitely hadn't been there this morning. And then the taste returned. Not as strong as in the church, but unmistakably recognizable. The taste of old copper and something else, something primal, predatory. Suddenly, a ringing sound came from outside. The bells of St. Jude's Church. They were ringing to announce the end of the service. Arthur ran to the living room window, which overlooked the street. A few minutes later, the parishioners appeared. They walked in small groups, chatting, laughing, children running along the sidewalk. Mr. Abernathy was discussing something with the young father, the one who had been sitting in front. Everything was nauseatingly perfect, impossibly normal. He was about to turn away, to write it all off as his own madness, when something happened that made his blood run cold. The young father, after saying goodbye to Mr. Abernathy, stopped for a second in the middle of the sidewalk. He froze, as if listening to something. And then, slowly, with an unnatural fluidity, he turned his head. directly toward Arthur's house, directly toward his window. For a split second, the man's face became completely impassive, and his eyes became those same empty, dead voids. And then he smiled. A wide, predatory smile that had nothing to do with friendliness. It was a smile of recognition. A conspirator's smile. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned back to his family and walked on. Arthur stumbled back from the window, his back hitting the wall. It hadn't been in his head. It was real. And they knew that he knew. Arthur spent the rest of the day in a feverish state. He paced from room to room, checking the locks on the windows and doors, drawing the curtains. His house, his sanctuary, had suddenly become a cage. Outside was the idyllic little town of Havenwood, but now Arthur saw it differently. He saw it as a stage where a perfect life was being acted out, and at any moment, the actors could drop their masks and reveal their empty eyes. He couldn't eat. The thought of food brought on a wave of nausea, bringing back that taste. Instead, a new strange feeling settled in his stomach. It wasn't hunger in the usual sense. It was an emptiness, cold and gnawing, demanding something he couldn't define. Something raw. He tried to distract himself. He turned on the television, but the cheerful faces of the hosts and actors seemed fake, grotesque. He picked up a book but couldn't focus on the words. Every sentence blurred before his eyes, and a single thought hammered in his head. They know that I know. The key figure in all of this was Father Michael. Where had he gone? Was he part of this nightmare? Or its first victim? Arthur found the number for the church rectory in the phone book. His finger hovered over the keypad several times. What would he say? Hello, Father, sorry to bother you. But did it seem to you that the communion today tasted of human flesh? Casting aside his doubts, he dialed the number. Long, agonizing rings. No one answered. He was about to hang up when he heard a click on the other end. But not a voice. Just silence, filled with a faint static crackle, like breathing. Hello, Arthur said, his voice trembling. Father Michael? Silence. But he could feel someone was there. Someone was listening. Who is this? He whispered. In response, a quiet, wet clicking sound came from the receiver, like someone slowly opening and closing their jaw. The same sound he had heard in the church. With a cry, Arthur threw the phone as if it were red hot. It hit the wall and shattered into pieces. Panic washed over him again. He was cut off. The police? They would lock him in a madhouse. Friends? He had no close friends in Havenwood, only acquaintances. After Lily's death, he had shut everyone out. The sun began to set, painting the sky in blood-orange hues. Long shadows crept across his lawn, turning the familiar world into something sinister. And in those shadows, he began to see them. At first, it was just a figure standing on the street corner, barely visible in the deepening twilight. A person just stood there, watching his house. Then a car drove by very slowly, and the driver, it seemed to Arthur, never took his eyes off his windows. A man walked past with a dog, the same young father. He stopped directly across from the house, pretending the dog was sniffing a lamppost, but his head was turned toward Arthur. They weren't hiding. Not really. They were just there, watching. It was like predators surrounding their prey, taking their time, studying it, savoring its fear. Arthur turned off all the lights in the house and huddled in the darkest armchair in the living room, from where he could see the street through a crack in the curtains. His heart pounded in time with the ticking of the old grandfather clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Each beat measured out the seconds of his agony. He realized they weren't going to break in. Not tonight. They were playing with him. They wanted him to understand that there was no escape. Wherever he went in this town, he would be surrounded. Every friendly, smiling neighbor, every shopkeeper, every child playing in the street, any one of them could be one of them. Night fell completely on Havenwood. The streets emptied. The streetlights cast orange circles on the vacant asphalt. The watchers were gone, but Arthur knew they were still nearby, dissolved into the shadows, but their invisible presence was felt even more keenly. Despair battled with anger inside him. He couldn't just sit here and wait for them to come for him. He had to do something, to understand what this was, what had happened to this town, to its people, and what had they done to him. The answer was where it all began, in St. Jude's Church. There, within its walls, in its history, there had to be a clue. He didn't know what he would be looking for, but he had to try. Tonight, under the cover of darkness, when the whole town was asleep or pretending to be, he would go back. The thought filled him with icy terror, but the alternative, sitting and waiting for his fate, was even more frightening. Glancing at the clock, he saw it was already midnight. Time to act. His preparations were frantic and silent. Arthur moved through his dark house like a ghost, driven by adrenaline and fear. He put on dark clothes and pulled a beanie over his head. Into a backpack, he stuffed a heavy flashlight, a multi-tool, and a crowbar from the garage. A weapon. The thought was wild, but he couldn't shake it. He didn't know what he would face, but his survival instinct screamed that going empty-handed was suicide. Slipping out the back door, he plunged into the cold night silence. Havenwood was asleep, but it was an unhealthy, predatory sleep. Arthur stuck to the shadows, darting from one dark yard to another. Every rustle made him freeze, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt as if empty eyes were watching him from every window, that someone was lurking behind every fence, waiting. The moon, nearly full, occasionally peeked out from behind the clouds, bathing the streets in a deathly pale light and turning familiar landscapes into a set for a nightmare. St. Jude's Church loomed over the town, its dark spire piercing the night sky like a black fong. As he got closer, Arthur felt the air grow colder, denser. The familiar scent of incense and wax was replaced by something else. A faint smell of damp earth and a slaughterhouse. The main doors were, of course, locked. He circled the building, sliding along the cold stone wall. The windows were too high, but at the back, behind the apse, he found what he had hoped for, a low barred window, likely leading to a crypt or basement. The grate was old and rusty. Jamming the end of the crowbar into the gap between the grate and the stone, he put his full weight into it. A deafening screech of rusted metal against stone echoed in the night. Arthur froze, listening. Silence. No one came running at the noise. With another heave and a sickening squeal, the grate gave way. He bent it just enough to squeeze through. Jumping down onto the dirt floor, he found himself in absolute darkness. The air here was stale, heavy. It smelled of mold, decay, and that same sweetish scent of blood. He switched on his flashlight. The beam snatched a low, vaulted room from the gloom, filled with old church furniture, broken pews, and stacks of yellowed books. The basement. At the far end of the basement, he saw a narrow wooden door. It led up into the main building. The door was unlocked. Climbing the creaking steps, he found himself in the sacristy, a small room where the priest prepared for service. Everything here was in its place. Vestments hung on a rack. An open Bible lay on a small table. But there was a tension in the air, as if something terrible had happened here very recently. Arthur passed through the sacristy and pushed open the door to the main hall of the church. The darkness here was alive, oppressive. The beam of his flashlight slid over the rows of empty pews, over the altar. The colored reflections from the stained glass windows, which had seemed so beautiful during the day, now in the moonlight, looked like dry drops of blood. The silence was absolute. He couldn't even hear sounds from the street. He decided to start with Father Michael's office, located in a small corridor behind the altar. The door was ajar. Peeking inside, he felt his heart sink. The office was trashed. Books lay on the floor. Desk drawers were pulled out and their contents scattered. Papers were strewn everywhere. This was an ordinary mess. These were the signs of a desperate struggle or a frantic search. Arthur knelt and began to sift through the papers. Bills, parish reports, drafts of sermons. Nothing unusual. He scanned the bookshelves. Most of the books were theological, but one stood out. A thick volume in a plain leather binding with no title. He picked it up. The leather felt strange to the touch, soft and warm, almost like human skin. Opening the book, he saw pages filled with uneven, cramped handwriting. It was a diary. Father Michael's diary. The last entries were made a few days ago. Arthur scanned them, his breath growing more and more ragged. They are getting stronger. Their hunger is growing. The old rituals no longer satisfy them. They demand more. Mr. Henderson told me today that his roses aren't blooming as brightly. He knows what they're missing. They all know. I tried to fight it. Tried to replace the substance. But they could tell. They watched me during the service. There's no more faith in their eyes. Only expectation. They are waiting for the feast. And then the final entry, written in a trembling hand, the ink smeared as if by tears or haste. Today, they said today, a new lamb will come to the flock. They say his grief has made him receptive. They are waiting for him. God forgive me. I can't stop them. It came to this town long before me. It has always been here, under the stones of this church. It was only sleeping, and now it has woken up. And it is hungry. Arthur dropped the diary. The new lamb, it was him. His grief. They had used it. This wasn't a random event. It was a trap. And he had walked right into it. And then he heard a sound. From the main hall. A quiet, wet, shuffling sound. And then another. And another. As if someone was walking slowly, very slowly, down the central aisle. And then another sound joined the shuffling. That sound. A quiet, rhythmic, smacking chewing. Arthur switched off his flashlight and froze, becoming all ears. He wasn't alone in the church. They had come for him. Or they had been waiting here for him all along. He huddled in the darkest corner behind an overturned desk, gripping the cold steel of the crowbar in his hand. The sounds grew louder, approaching the office door. The office door creaked open. Arthur held his breath, his knuckles white on the handle of the crowbar. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, tall and stooped. In the moonlight filtering in from the main hall, Arthur recognized him. Mr. Abernathy. Old, harmless Mr. Abernathy, who always gave the children mints. But there was nothing harmless about him now. He moved with an unnatural, jerky grace, like a marionette on strings. His head was tilted at a strange angle, and his arms, which seemed too long, hung at his sides, almost touching the floor. He slowly entered the room, and the sound of chewing became unbearably loud. He was eating something. Arthur saw what the old man was holding in his hand. It was a shoe. An old, worn priest shoe. And he was gnawing on the leather toe, tearing off pieces and slowly, methodically chewing them with his dentures. Then Mr. Abernathy raised his head and looked directly into the dark corner where Arthur was hiding. His eyes were empty, but deep within them, in the very blackness of his pupils, Arthur saw something. Movement, as if tiny, dark insects were squirming there. And he smiled, a toothless, wet smile. He knew Arthur was here. He had always known. Instinct took over. Arthur leaped out from behind the desk with a wild cry, more like the roar of a wounded animal. He swung the crowbar, aiming for the head, but the old man reacted with inhuman speed. He recoiled, and the blow landed on his shoulder. There was a dry, sickening crunch, like a rotting branch snapping. Mr. Abernathy didn't even cry out. He just looked at his unnaturally twisted shoulder, and then back at Arthur. And his smile grew wider. A low, gurgling sound escaped his throat. Not a laugh, but rather the sound of air escaping from a punctured lung. Shoving him aside, Arthur bolted from the office. He didn't run for the exit. He knew it was useless. He ran deeper into the church, toward the altar. The diary. It has always been here, under the stones of this church. He had to find that place. He vaulted over the altar rail, his boots thudding on the stone floor. The shuffling footsteps behind him quickened. It was no longer a slow, creeping gait. It was a run. Clumsy, broken, but very fast. Arthur frantically felt around the altar. It was made of a single piece of marble, massive and immovable. No doors, no hatches. He glanced back. Mr. Abernathy was already entering the sanctuary, his broken arm dangling like a rag. And behind him, in the central aisle, other figures were appearing. Mrs. Henderson, the young father. Dozens of shadows, gliding silently and swiftly between the pews. The entire flock was gathering for their nightly mass. In desperation, Arthur kicked a decorative panel at the base of the altar. A dull, hollow sound echoed back. Emptiness. Fumbling for the edge of the panel, he pulled. With a dry crack, the old wood gave way. Behind it was darkness. A narrow, black chasm and stone steps leading deep underground. The smell of damp earth and slaughter hit him with such force that he staggered. Without a second thought, he dove into the passage. He could hear them approaching, their shuffling and quiet, hungry chewing merging into a single nightmarish chorus. He slammed the wooden panel shut behind him and began to descend the slippery, chipped steps in blind darkness. He switched his flashlight back on. He was in a narrow tunnel carved out of the rock. The walls were damp, covered in slime and something that looked like dark moss. The air was icy. The steps led down deeper and deeper. It felt as if he were descending into the very heart of the earth. The descent ended as abruptly as it had begun. The tunnel opened into a huge, irregularly shaped cavern. The ceiling was lost somewhere in the darkness above, and from the walls hung not stalactites, but thick, pulsating roots that looked like veins. The cavern was illuminated. The source of the light was what lay at its center. Arthur froze, unable to look away. His brain refused to comprehend what he was seeing. It was not an altar. It was a living creature the size of a small house. It had no definite shape. It was a mountain of pulsating crimson flesh, covered with hundreds or thousands of small mouths that were constantly opening and closing. From these mouths oozed a thick, dark fluid, which trickled down the creature's sides and collected in a shallow pool at its base. The same blood he had drunk. On the surface of this mountain of flesh grew pale, mushroom-like growths, resembling wafers. The body, and around this living altar, people were moving. His congregation. They moved slowly in a trance. They would approach the creature, collect the dark fluid in silver chalices, slice off the pale growths with knives, and place them on patens. Among them was Father Michael. His face was gray, his eyes utterly empty. He moved like an automaton, performing his gruesome duties. He was not their leader. He was their first slave. Arthur understood everything. This wasn't a satanic ritual. It was something far more ancient and terrible. This town didn't worship the devil. It worshipped this. It fed it. And it, in turn, fed them, binding them into a single, unholy organism. And then the strange, gnawing hunger that had tormented him all day flared up with a new, unbearable intensity. His mouth filled with saliva. The taste of blood on his tongue became sharper. A part of him, the part they had poisoned with their communion, recognized its God. It wanted to join the feast. He stumbled back, fighting the repulsive desire rising from within. The noise he made was tiny, but in the echoing cavern, it sounded like a gunshot. The movement around the living altar ceased. Dozens of heads with empty eyes slowly turned in his direction. Father Michael, Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Abernathy, who was standing at the very entrance to the tunnel. They were all looking at him. And then the enormous central creature noticed him too. Its thousands of small mouths stopped pulsating and froze. Absolute silence fell upon the cavern. And then one, the largest mouth at the very top of the mountain of flesh, slowly opened, and from it came a soundless scream that struck Arthur's mind directly. And he understood. They weren't going to kill him. They were waiting for him to come home. The silent scream was not a sound, but a physical blow. A mental wave of pure primal will that commanded, called, "Return. You are ours. You are part of the body." The command resonated not in his ears, but in his very blood, in the alien substance that now flowed through his veins. The hunger, which had been only background noise before, now erupted into a roaring flame, consuming him from the inside. But primal fear, the fear of being absorbed and assimilated, proved stronger. He broke out of his stupor. Without thinking, without planning, he turned and scrambled back up the slippery steps of the tunnel. Behind him, he heard the silence in the cavern give way to movement, the rustle of dozens of bodies, fast, slithering, no longer mimicking human gait. He burst out from behind the altar like a cork from a bottle. The main hall of the church was no longer empty. Shadows stood in the aisles between the pews. More shadows. Those who had not gone down were waiting for him here. They stood motionless, their empty eyes reflecting the dim moonlight. Silent sentinels. Arthur didn't run for the main entrance. He darted into the sacristy, and from there to the basement. His lungs were on fire, but his body, fueled by adrenaline and something else, moved with unprecedented speed and strength. He pulled himself up and climbed out through the same window he had entered, scraping his hands on the rusted metal. The night air brought no relief. The town had changed. A light was on in every house he ran past, and in every window stood a silhouette. Men, women, children. They didn't move. They just stood and watched him run. Their collective gaze felt like a physical pressure, like a spider's web that grew tighter with every step he took. All of Havenwood had become a single watching eye. He ran, and the world around him changed. His senses were heightened to their absolute limit. He could see the cracks in the asphalt in the dim light of the street lamps. He could hear the rustle of leaves on trees a block away. And the smells. The world had become a symphony of scents. He could smell the damp leaves, the cooling asphalt, his own sweat, thick with fear, and something else. From the houses, from behind the tightly shut doors, came another smell. Warm, alluring, metallic. The smell of life. The smell of food. The hunger twisted his stomach so violently that he doubled over. His body demanded. It knew what it needed to quell this agony. And that knowledge was the most terrifying thing of all. He reached his house but didn't stop. It was a trap. Instead, he veered toward the garage where his old car was parked. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely fit the key into the ignition. The engine, to his immense relief, started on the first try. He pulled out onto the street, flooring the gas pedal. He sped through the empty streets of the sleeping town that wasn't really sleeping. From every house, they watched him. He flew onto the highway, leading out of town. The streetlights fell away behind him, and he was surrounded by darkness, broken only by his headlights. Away, 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 hammered in his head. He drove for 10-15 minutes. The forest on either side of the road was an impenetrable wall. The road didn't change. Not a single turn, not a single intersection. Just a straight black ribbon of asphalt. And then he saw lights ahead. The town. It couldn't be. Too soon. He drove closer, and his blood ran cold. A wooden sign, illuminated by his headlights, read, "Welcome to Havenwood. Population 1,347. He was back. Or he had never left. The road was a trap. The town was a trap. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding. In desperation, he yanked the wheel, veered off the road, and drove across a field until the wheels sank into the mud. He abandoned the car. Run. The only way out was through the forest. He plunged into the thicket, breaking branches, stumbling over roots. He ran until he was out of breath and collapsed onto the damp earth, gasping. And in the silence, broken only by his own breathing, he heard the forest come alive. A quiet snap of twigs. A rustle in the undergrowth. Not the sounds of ordinary nocturnal animals. These sounds were purposeful. They were surrounding him. He knew they were coming for him, taking their time. They knew he had nowhere to go. It was then that he looked at his hands in the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. His skin seemed pale, almost transparent. And underneath, a dark network was emerging. His veins had blackened, spreading, forming the same web-like pattern as on his tongue. The transformation that had begun with the communion was continuing. It was remaking him, turning him into one of them. And the hunger became unbearable. It was no longer just an emptiness in his stomach. It was an agony that gripped every cell of his body. He realized he would die if he didn't satisfy this craving. Or worse, he would cease to be himself, and only this hunger trapped in his body would remain. He got to his feet. He needed shelter. A place to wait until dawn to think. And he remembered. The old sawmill by the river, abandoned years ago. Far from the town center, hidden in the woods. It was his only last chance. Gathering the last of his will, he trudged through the dark, whispering forest, driven by despair. And behind him, in the shadows, the silent hunt continued. The sawmill looked like the skeleton of a prehistoric monster, silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. The dilapidated structures sagged under their own weight, and the tall chimney of the brick lumber kiln resembled a broken fawn. The air here was thick, smelling of river damp, rotting wood, and rusted metal. To Arthur, it was the smell of sanctuary. He slipped into the main workshop through a breach in the wall. Inside, it was gloomy. Moonlight barely penetrated the boarded-up windows. Huge, rust-covered circular saws were frozen, as if stopped mid-scream. Scraps of wood and piles of sawdust, which had compacted over the years into a dense, damp mass, lay everywhere. Arthur found the darkest corner behind an old steam engine and huddled into it, trying to still his shaking. The rustling in the forest had stopped. He knew that didn't mean they were gone. They had just taken their positions. They had surrounded the sawmill, knowing their prey was trapped. They could wait. Tom was on their side. It was here, in this rotting silence, that the hunger returned with a new, monstrous force. It was no longer just a physical pain. Now the hunger had a voice. It whispered in his head, using his own thoughts, his own memories. It's not so bad, Arthur. It's just the next step. Evolution. You've always felt lonely, especially after Lily. You'll never be lonely again. We will be together. We will be one. Look at your hand. Feel the strength. Your old, weak body is dying. Something better is being born. He looked at his hand. The blackened veins under his pale skin pulsed faintly in time with his heart. He could feel his body changing. The ache in his muscles had been replaced by the feeling of a taut string, full of coiled energy. His hearing was so sharp he could distinguish the sound of a drop of water falling from the leaky roof at the other end of the workshop. The voice grew more insistent, sweeter, more persuasive. It showed him images. Succulent, blood red. No, he couldn't. He didn't want to think about it. He clung to the only thing he had left, the memory of Lily. He closed his eyes and tried to summon her image. Her smile, the sound of her laugh, the feel of her hand in his. But the image was faint, distant. The hunger distorted it, casting a crimson shadow over her face. The voice mocked him. She's gone, Arthur. She left you. But we are here. We will never leave you. Shut up, he rasped aloud, slamming his fist against the rusty metal of the engine. And at that moment, he heard a new sound. Not from the pursuers outside, but here inside. A quiet scratching of hooves on the wooden floor. And then a frightened snort. From behind a pile of old planks, a deer appeared. A young one, probably separated from its herd. It had wandered into the sawmill, seeking shelter from night predators, not knowing that the most dangerous predator was already here. The deer froze, its large, dark eyes staring fearfully into the darkness. It had scented Arthur, and Arthur scented it. The smell of warm blood flowing beneath the thin hide. The smell of a beating life. The aroma hit him like a drug, drowning out everything else. The voice in his head stopped whispering. It screamed, "Yes, there it is. Our food. Take it." "No," Arthur whispered, pressing himself against the wall. His nails scraped against the metal. He fought, but it was a battle he was already losing. His body was acting on its own. His muscles tensed. He rose to his feet, slowly, silently. His movements were no longer entirely human, fluid, flowing, predatory. The deer sensed the mortal danger. It turned to flee, and Arthur leaped. He didn't remember crossing the distance between them. He only remembered the feeling of warm, soft fur under his fingers, which suddenly felt as hard as claws. He remembered the animal's short, hoarse cry, and he remembered giving in. He sank his teeth into the deer's neck. The explosion of taste in his mouth was ecstasy. The hot, salty, living substance flooded his throat, quenching the agony of hunger. It was nothing like the nauseating imitation in the church. This was the real thing, and it was divine. He drank, and the roaring fire inside him was replaced by a warm, pleasant glow. Strength poured into him, every cell in his body singing with delight. When it was over, he pulled back, breathing heavily. The deer's body lay at his feet. His face, hands, and clothes were covered in blood. And as the ecstasy faded, it was replaced by an icy, all-consuming horror at what he had done. He looked at his hands. His fingers seemed longer, his nails sharper and darker. He ran his tongue over his teeth. His canines had become sharper, longer. He had done it. He had killed. And he had liked it. The part of him that was still Arthur Blackwood screamed in silent despair. The hunger had subsided, but the emptiness remained. Now it was filled not with pain, but with something worse, knowledge. Knowledge of what he was becoming. And the connection, he felt it. A thin, invisible thread stretched from him to the forest, to the dozens of minds waiting outside. He felt their collective satisfaction. Their approval. Good, a single calm voice of the flock rustled in his mind. You are learning. Now you are ready to come home. At that moment, the first rays of dawn broke through the cracks in the sawmill walls, falling on the mutilated body of the deer. And from outside, from all sides, came the sound of approaching footsteps. Slow, confident, the steps of people coming to collect their lost sheep. They entered not as hunters pursuing prey, but as shepherds coming for a lost lamb. Without haste, without aggression. One by one, the residents of Havenwood stepped through the wide breach in the wall. The young father, whom Arthur now mentally called Thomas. Mrs. Henderson, with smudges of dirt on her apron. Mr. Abernathy, his shoulders set and moving perfectly naturally. Behind them, other familiar faces, the baker, the postman, the librarian. They were all here. They stopped, forming a semicircle, their empty eyes fixed on Arthur. But there was no judgment in their gaze. Only a calm, all-understanding expectation. They weren't looking at the blood covering him, but through it, into his very essence. Arthur stood over the deer's corpse, breathing heavily. He had expected an attack, a fight, but their passivity was disarming and far more frightening. He gripped the crowbar in his hand, but he felt how useless it was. It was like threatening a tidal wave with a club. Thomas took a step forward. In the morning light, he looked completely ordinary. A tired family man in a simple shirt and jeans. But his voice, when he spoke, was not entirely his. It was deeper, resonant, and it could be heard the echoes of dozens of other voices merge into one. "You didn't need to run for so long, Arthur," he said. There was no reproach in his tone, only a slight sadness. "We would have found you anyway. We always find our own." Arthur backed away until his back hit the cold metal of the steam engine. "What are you?" he rasped. Thomas's smile was almost sympathetic. "We are Havenwood. We are a family. The body you saw beneath the church is our heart, our collective soul. It feeds us, and we feed it. It is a simple, eternal symbiosis." Symbiosis. Arthur laughed bitterly. "You're monsters. Monster is a judgment," Thomas replied calmly. "Is a lion a monster when it eats a gazelle? Is a spider a monster when it spins its web? We simply are. We have existed far longer than this town, than these trees. We are a part of this land. And now you are a part of us." He gestured with his chin toward the dead deer. "You felt it, didn't you? The first true satiation. Not the pale imitation we give in the church to maintain the connection. Real life. Real power." Arthur couldn't deny it. Even now, through the horror and disgust, he could feel a new energy flowing through his veins. His body hummed like a tuned instrument. "The hunger will return, Arthur," the collective voice continued. "And each time, it will be stronger. Animals will soon not be enough. You will begin to look at others, at those who are not part of the body. Outsiders. And one day, you won't be able to hold back. You will become a wild, unthinking beast. We cannot allow that. It would disrupt the harmony." He took another step. "But there is another way. Join us, truly. Become part of the collective. We will teach you to control the hunger. We will teach you everything we know. You will never be alone again. Your grief, it will vanish. In unity, there is no room for personal pain." The last words hit Arthur harder than any physical blow. His grief, all that was left of Lily, all that made him himself. They wanted to take that too. To replace his love, his pain, with their empty, collective satiety. "Lily," he whispered, and the name was like a prayer. For a moment, it seemed to Arthur that Thomas's eyes focused, and something akin to pity flickered in them. "Your grief was the gateway, Arthur. It created an emptiness in you that we were able to fill. Lily would have wanted you to live, for you not to suffer. You have no right to say her name." Arthur roared, and his voice sounded strange, deeper and louder than usual. The residents of Havenwood didn't flinch. They just waited. "You have a choice," Thomas said, his voice once again even and impassive. "Accept yourself. Accept us. Come home with us to the church. Or stay here. We will not touch you. We will simply leave, and we will leave you alone with your new hunger. Sooner or later, you will crawl back to us. Or we will come to clean up what you become." They offered him the illusion of choice, knowing that in reality, there was none. Surrender now, or surrender later, after agony and madness. Arthur looked at their calm faces, at his hands stained with blood, at the body of the deer at his feet, and then his gaze drifted to the side, to the huge, dark mouth of the old brick lumber kiln. Inside it, remnants of coal and dry wood chips still lay. Fire. The only thing that could cleanse, that could destroy. He could have lunged at them with a crowbar. They would have overpowered him in seconds. He could have tried to run, but where to? The whole world was now their hunting ground. Or he could choose a third way, an inn, on his own terms. The collective mind of the flock seemed to sense his thought. Something like unease flickered in their empty eyes. "Don't do anything foolish, Arthur," Thomas said, and for the first time a note of insistence entered his voice. "The body needs you. Your strength. It's new, it's different. You could become something more than just one of us." They didn't want to lose him. That was their weakness. Arthur slowly straightened up, letting go of the crowbar. It fell with a dull thud into the sawdust. He raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. "All right," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. "You win." He took a step forward, away from the deer's body. Then another. He walked toward them, his head bowed like a repenting sinner. No emotion showed on the faces of Havenwood's residents, but through his new, terrible connection, he felt a wave of their collective relief. He walked toward them, but he wasn't looking at them. He was looking past them, at the breach in the wall, beyond which a new, blood-red day was dawning, and he was counting his every step. They parted to let him pass, forming a living corridor. Their movements were fluid, synchronized, like a school of fish. Arthur walked slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. He could feel their collective attention, as dense as a physical touch. They were studying him, probing his thoughts, but he had erected a wall of emptiness and submission. Step by step, he approached the exit. Outside, it was fully light now. The sky was painted in soft, pastel tones that contrasted sharply with the bloody scene in the sawmill. A few more feet, and he would be between Thomas and Mrs. Henderson. It was at that moment that he made his move. Instead of taking the next step forward, he lunged to the side. Not toward the exit, but directly at Thomas. All the newfound unholy strength of his transformed body went into a single shove. Thomas wasn't expecting it. He was expecting submission. The blow hit him in the chest, and he flew backward like a bowling pin, knocking down two others behind him. For a split second, the collective mind faltered. The synchronicity was broken. A momentary confusion rippled through their ranks, like a disturbance on the surface of water. It was enough. Arthur spun and dashed not for the forest, but for the dark maw of the brick kiln. He dove into the low opening, scraping his back on the bricks, and rolled onto the cold, ash-covered floor. Outside, a single unified shriek of fury and disappointment erupted, an inhuman sound, torn from dozens of human throats. They understood his plan. Inside the kiln, it was dark and cramped. It smelled of old smoke and desperation. Arthur fumbled frantically in his backpack. The flashlight. He snatched it out and without hesitation, smashed the glass against the brick wall. The glass shattered, the bulb cracked. He tore the batteries and the short, thin wires leading to the contacts from the housing. A shadow appeared at the entrance to the kiln. Thomas. His face was contorted with a fury that did not belong to him. His eyes burned with a cold, dark fire. "You can't do this, Arthur. This vessel belongs to us. It belongs to the body," the collective voice boomed. Arthur wasn't listening. He crouched, pouring out the dry wood chips and tinder he had gathered on his way. He pressed the bare ends of the wires to the battery terminals. Nothing. Other figures began to gather at the entrance. They didn't come inside, as if instinctively afraid of the enclosed space and what he was about to do. "Fool." The voice screamed in his head now, the voice of hunger, the voice of survival. "We can live forever. Power. No more pain. Remember the ecstasy." He scraped the wires together again and again. He thought of Lily, not the one whose image the hunger desecrated, but the real one. He remembered a cold winter evening when the power had gone out in their house. They had sat before the fireplace, wrapped in a single blanket. The flames cast dancing shadows on her face, and she had laughed, saying it was even romantic. Warmth. Pure, real warmth. "I'm coming to you, Lily," he whispered. He pressed the ends of the wires to the terminals a third time. A tiny, blindingly white spark leaped from the copper and fell into the small pile of dry wood dust. For a moment, nothing happened. And then the dust ignited. A small flame ran along the wood chips, growing, becoming a greedy, hungry fire. The dry, resin-soaked wood, the old sawdust that had accumulated here for decades, the entire kiln was perfect kindling. The flames roared, filling the entire space. The residents of Havenwood at the entrance recoiled from the sudden heat. For the first time, horror was reflected on their impassive faces. They saw Arthur's silhouette engulfed in flames. The pain was unimaginable, cleansing. It burned not only his flesh but also the alien substance in his veins, severing the mental link to the flock. The last thing he felt was the thread connecting him to them snapping. He was alone again. He was himself again. And in the roaring flames, before everything was consumed by darkness, he saw her. Lily's smile, clear and bright. At the sawmill, the residents of Havenwood stood silently, watching as a column of black, greasy smoke billowed from the tall brick chimney, rising into the clear morning sky. They felt no pain, the fire was too far away. But they felt the loss. An emptiness where a new, bright spark had just been in their collective consciousness. Something unique, something strong had been torn from them. They stood for a long time, until the roar of the fire began to subside. Then, without a single word, they turned and trudged back to town. The masks of normality were back on their faces. The baker would go bake bread. The postman would deliver mail. Mrs. Henderson would return to her roses. But something had changed. A tiny, yet palpable crack had appeared in their unity. For the first time in many decades, someone had said no to them. And his cry, though silent, still echoed in their shared soul. Havenwood went on with its quiet, eternal life. But now, in its empty eyes, the reflection of a distant fire was forever frozen.